is a lupin, and there are lupins that are grown all over the country, and our lupin is here in Central Texas, and that's important to have a Texas bluebonnet. Okay. And I'm sorry, I didn't really realize we were on the air. Are we on the air now?
Yeah, we
so
are.
Okay. Okay. All right. So so the first chore is to collect the seed. Let's say you've got it from your neighbor's yard and it's a beautiful bluebonnet patch and you've collected seed. You're going to ideally hover around your neighbor, and the best way to do it is when these bluebonnets are spent, meaning their flower is done. Do not mow them yet. Do not collect the seed yet. You're going to wait for them to go good and ugly. So you want the whole plant to go kind of brown. You want to start to see the seeds producing in the flower, and they look like small pebbles. They're about the size of a crushed granite pebble. And what we like to do is when all of the bluebonnets are done, remember they're annuals, so you don't have to keep the rootstock. You can just pull that plant out very carefully, so not to use the seed, throw it in a paper bag, or even better yet, if you have a big tarp, let's say you have got a big bluebonnet area, once you start to see that seed really produce and all this is yucky and brown, you're going to delicately put that whole plant on that tarp or in that brown bag. Then you're going to take that, and this would be in the fall. So this is definitely in the fall, and don't rush it. People rush it. They'll want to mow them right when they're done blooming, but you want that seed to be nice and mature and about this big as this little pebble. So you're going to...
It happens in the fall?
It happens in the, well, late summer. Okay. So not even late summer, I'm sorry. So we're in right now, it depends on the season. We're right now in late March. These are gonna look beautiful for another couple weeks, but it's gonna take a couple weeks for them to get good and ugly and for those seeds to produce. You're gonna throw the plants on the tarp or in a bag, and then wait for all that seed to fall off of the plant naturally. It's going to take the last little bit of nutrients that the plant is going to give it, and that's going to mature that seed. You're going to save the seed until fall. And so late summer, early fall is when you want to start preparing, ideally, if it's your new bluebonnet bed, an area, and this is a great example, where you might have a little bit of grass or you might have a little bit of other flowers, but something that people don't think about is that bluebonnets come up nice and small. There's some small ones here, but this is one big plant, so they get quite large, and they don't like to compete for space. So even though in the wild you'll see bluebonnets in grassy places, where you really see the concentration of bluebonnets are in those ditches where they are kind of alone. They're not competing for space. So it's really important when you're doing a bluebonnet patch at home that you have a nice wide open space just for your bluebonnets. We don't do a lot of companion plants for that. We have some short buffalo grass that's in here that's really short. But even that will sort of delicately trim around so we make sure that those bluebonnets have tons of space. So in the fall, you're going to have your area nicely prepared. You want that soil nice and chunky. You want the weeds out. You want other perennials out of the way. And you're going to throw that seed down in the fall. You'll want to do it when you know that there's a nice big rain that's coming up. They prefer to be watered with rainwater rather than city water. All plants germinate better in rainwater. So you're going to pick a nice fall day that looks like you're going to have some nice rain, not a gully washer, because remember that seed is about as big as a pebble and it's going to whoosh away if that rain is too hard. So that's one of the bluebonnet tips. I get a lot of questions about, hey, every year I spend all this money on bluebonnet seeds and I don't have any bluebonnets, but my neighbor has a ton. I always ask, is your neighbor downhill? So you got to remember here in Central Texas, when those big rains come, that can really wash away those bluebonnet seeds downhill. Water's always going to go down. You can see in the foreground or in the background here that big pass of bluebonnets that looks much larger than our front pass. That was because the water whooshed that area when we had that big flooding. And so it kind of washed that seed and it collected in the areas.
So you don't want to plant them, you just want to scatter them?
You want to scatter them. Nope, you're going to scatter them because you got to remember when you're mimicking an annual in nature, what was it going to do in nature? These plants, they're not an airborne seed, they're a hard seed, so they literally fall straight from that plant right where they're set. So you're going to scatter that seed right where you want them. And you're going to want it to be a little bit protected, again, with a border or some sort of elevation that's going to keep that seed in place. You don't really need to cover it. Some people cover it with a little bit of sand to kind of hold it in place. You can do that. You can play around with that. There's lots of tips on it, but generally your best guess is to have that chunky soil, something a little bit churned up so that that seed is caught in those little crevices. If it's a perfectly smooth, you know, flat top soil, it's going to run the risk of probably being washed away in the water.
So whenever you pick the seeds in let's say, when do you think it's going to happen this year? Like in late April when the seeds are going to come out?
Yeah, rather than looking at the calendar, you're really going to want to look at the plant. So every year it's going to happen with the weather. This bluebonnet season started out really early. They got really big. They had some spring water. Then it got cold again, which has sustained it. That's going to be great for bluebonnet seeds next year. These plants are living longer, and then you want them to die. That's the hard part. You want your yard to look pretty, and you don't want a bunch of dead plants. But if you want good seed, you want them to really mature on the plant. So I like to pull it with the plant. And I'm going to say this year, mid-late April. Yeah.
I'm sorry. And so whenever you pull the plant out, what do you do with it then?
It's a dead plant because it's an annual. So its life cycle is just once. You're not killing a plant. It has no chance of rerooting from root. It can only reproduce by seed. So you're okay pulling it right out of the ground.
And then do you put it, I heard some people put them in a freezer to save it.
I like to collect them. We collect so much. We do a tarp. But I like, for home purposes, I'd put them in a brown paper bag. Every day, every couple days, shake that bag. The more you hear the seed, you know that they're apart from the plant. Once you really hear seed, and you can pull out that dead foliage, and then just keep it in that brown paper bag in a nice dark place until fall. So a nice cool dark place, just like you'd store an old potato or something if you're trying, or an old bulb. They don't necessarily have to be cold stratified at all. The cold is where, let's say you weren't planting them in the fall and they didn't get that winter call. But if you're throwing them out in the fall, they're going to get that cold stratification in the winter months alone in nature. And they're going to prefer that because they're going to get more winter rains.
And in the fall, like when should that be? Like October?
Again, it's a little weather dependent. So I like to do it right before it starts to get cold. But I really watch the rains. Sometimes we get a fall rain band where it's heavy, heavy rains and flooding. And so we want to make sure that it's not going to do that. You're never going to get it quite right. And it sometimes might take you a couple years to really get that base. This area, which we call our photo spot, has been planted a couple years after years, and it starts to have its own seed base. So your first year, if you're lucky, it's going to be a cute show. Your second year, if you try that same space and they're successful, year after year, it should get showier. And year after year, you hardly have to do any self-sowing. It will sow itself. The biggest thing, though, is make sure that plant is fully matured before you harvest that seed. You want it to look good and dead. People say, well, I just mow it after it bloomed and I didn't have any bluebonnets. Well, you mowed it before the seed matured. And so that's the big mistake. Yeah, so you want to wait to mow it. If you are going to mow it, you can, but wait till they're good and dead. And I prefer pulling it out. That way you have that old loose material.
And last question, you pretty much answered all of it when you explained the process of it, so that was perfect. However, how do you care for your bluebonnets? Like, let's say it's late February and you're seeing them come out, or is there something that you should do to them in the fall? Like, what is the process from fall whenever you plant them to spring whenever they're supposed to bloom? Like, is there something?
Yeah, that's a great question, because a lot of people think annuals are easy to do and they just work on their own beautifully. That is not true with the bluebonnet. I love bluebonnets, but they're fussy. So again, they need lots of space. They don't want to be crowded, so don't get over ambitious and plant other things with them. The other thing is they do not like to be stepped on. So we're always telling people, little kids, stay on the path. And one of the reasons we tell them that is a bluebonnet is extremely temperamental to being trampled on. So you'll want to have an area that's away from your paths. If I stepped on this bluebonnet, and the camera's probably too high, but if you step on it once, it's going to look a little flattened down. In 48 hours, that plant will be dead. So you want to keep your dogs off of it. You want to keep your kids off of it. You want to protect that bluebonnet area all fall and winter long. You will start to see them germinate, and they start as little plants. And once you see them, then you can kind of baby them better. But the main thing is you want to keep things from not climbing on them. So don't roll your mower over it or your wheelbarrow. You want to have a real protected area for that.
What about watering them? Should you water them?
Watering them, if you get good rains, and we had great rains, I would tend not to. You can do it in an irrigated bed. You don't want it to be too overwatered. They grow from a single stem, and it's a lot of leaf matter that has a lot of moisture in it. So the number one issue with bluebonnets isn't drying out, it's more the rotting. If they get too wet or too heavy or too big, that weight of that plant is like a tree toppling over, and they'll pinch, and once they're pinched, they'll never come back. So I watch that water carefully. I prefer to let the rains do the job all winter long. In the spring, when it starts to dry out a little bit, if that's the case, I tend to kind of baby them and water it. But I don't water too much, and I don't fertilize too much. You can buy bluebonnets early in the spring as plants. They technically don't really perform as well as doing it by seed, but if you don't have a neighbor and you're not sure where the seed is coming from, that's a good option. Plant them as tiny, small as you can. Don't try to plant them once they've already started to bloom. It's just going to be too hard. They don't like to be transplanted. They can do it when they're little.
So when you see them in the spring, let's say February, when it's just the plant, not the flowers yet,
Yeah.
you should kind of like keep an eye on the rains, like meaning like if it's raining enough, like they should be good.
Yeah.
And if it's pretty dry, then maybe water it like how much, like once a week?
Water it by sight. Again, I'm always really good for people to look at them. Bluebonnets are pretty good about telling you. So they're going to look a little dried out. When they're too wet, they're going to kind of grow really big. Like these guys got really big, and I was concerned they weren't going to last. But then it got cold again, and it sort of slowed down that process. So again, I stay away from a schedule. It's more a visual. You'll see the leaves kind of close up, and that means they're a little bit dry, and you can really visually tell. So in the early mornings in the dew, and you see them nice and wide open, they're happy. In the late afternoon, you'll kind of see them drying up. That's okay. But if they're looking dry in the morning, give them a little water. Yeah, so do it by sight. I always recommend people to really watch their plants and observe them rather than kind of going by schedule, because you'll miss a step. You can miss it.